mechanisms from 18th and 19th century colonialism to 21st century Harvard and Oxford. It's hard to see them until you start looking at work like Rajiv Malhotra's work, where you start realizing that no, these lineages exist. The same institutes are there at these institutions, and they share a sense of a set of prejudices. So you have the bizarre connection between Western intellectuals who are no longer Christian, right? They're still Abrahamic in their mindset. They're still Protestant and Puritanist in their mindset, even though they're no longer Christian. They're now secular. They're now atheist, and they still have that, vague um, detestation. It's not a Hindu phobia. No one's afraid of Hindus. It is a detestation of Hindus. It is an anti-Hindu bias. Now, it doesn't take a lot of bias through groupthink, through social networks, elite social networks. I don't mean online social networks, to solidify into an alliance. I mean, if you were to count the number of prominent Western scholars who are thoroughly opposed to Indian democracy, I mean, I named three earlier. Maybe you guys can name a fourth or a fifth. We're not talking about a lot of people. We're talking about a small number of well-positioned people who very comfortably work with anti-democratic Islamist intellectuals in their own universities, who share, if not necessarily an aversion or being anti-Hindu. I mean, Audrey Trusky is not anti-Hindu as such, but she thinks, from what I can tell, I've never met the woman, but she seems to think, she knows what would be a better Hinduism. And of course, that's not for us to decide what a better Hinduism would be. It's for Hindus to decide what a better Hinduism would be. But this is the challenge facing India: is this bizarre and unholy alliance between mostly Western Islamists and mostly Western Puritan heritage intellectuals. Look, it's up to Hindus to defend Hindus. Just before I came on, there was a speaker talking about, it's up to India to set the narrative on India. It's not my job. Now, it's your job, yes. And if you are Hindu and believe in organization for self-protection, obviously, organize, right? And I think that organized involvement in politics is almost always a good thing. Elites don't like that. I mean, whether it's elites in India in the 1940s and 50s, repressing the RSS because they viewed it threatening that someone outside the elite was organizing to be involved in society, or trying to organize society, as the RSS would have it. In the same way, in the United States, when ordinary people organize. I mean, you may have seen the school board protests in Virginia, and when ordinary parents came together and said, these are our schools, this is what we want for our schools and our children. Elites, they called in the FBI to investigate ordinary parents. And I wouldn't be surprised if Britain calls in MI5 to investigate Hindus who organize in Leicester, even though they're only organizing to present a more accurate narrative about their own community. The challenge for elites is that ordinary people in society, have their own voice in a democracy, and they can have it by organizing and by working together to amplify their own individual voices. Elites find that very threatening. It's unfortunate, but sure, you should do it. I'm sure people are already doing it. We all, and that's not just good for Hindus. I want to emphasize, I'm not Hindu. I'm not protecting Hindus. I'm not a spokesman for Hindus. Believe it or not, and please, no one come to my hotel and try to help me tomorrow. I'm too busy. I've never even been inside a Hindu temple. I've been in many mosques, many churches. I've never been inside a Hindu temple. I think it's the only major religion whose facilities I've never experienced. Look, I'm not doing this speaking, and I would encourage Muslims the same. That is, if Muslims in Leicester felt that their community was being improperly marginalized, I would say, you know what, get together, do it in a civil society sense. No, you don't need funding from Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. You don't need you don't need the mosque to speak for you. Very often now I don't know the situation in Leicester, but very often in Muslim communities, it becomes the 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 mosque that speaks for people instead of civil society speaking. Versus, my impression is that because Hindu, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, because Hindu temples tend not to have that kind of hierarchical organization, there's not this sort of people who speak for Hindus in the community because they are the religious leader. So, I would encourage Muslims to be civil society organizing, not just organizing within their religious organizations, but organizing without them in civil society. And Christians and atheists, I mean, there's nothing, it's positively good for democracy when there are multiple organized bases of opinion in society.
Thank you.
Look, I don't know if the cookie crumbled. I remind everyone the crowd of relatively elite, not relatively elite, absolutely elite, probably mostly, well, I don't know their politics, whether they're Congress supporting or not, but the crowd at the India Today conclave, and India Today is not a RSS organization, right? This is not part of the song. That crowd was enthused, and everyone, people clapped. And I want to tell you, I know Rajdeep, the journalist, Rajdeep. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name. Sardesai. Rajdeep Sardesai. I know he's got a lot of flack. He was absolutely professional with me. Rehearsed this all beforehand. He gave me these easy questions that I could give the answers to. But his mother, so I'm a sociologist. His mother is a Marxian sociologist here in India. I don't know her politics, but look, she's a Marxian sociologist. I know she disagrees with the politics of the current government in India. She came up to me afterwards, was so effusive, said it's so wonderful to see a sociologist engaging like this. She said, everything you said needed to be said. She said, I would use different methods. I would talk, but she kept shaking my hand. She wanted selfies with me. The India Today media people had to drag me away from her. She was saying all of her friends were there. So all these nice old ladies, were, oh, that's fantastic. You said that. Thank you for standing up for India. So, it's not the left. I think there are well-meaning, good-hearted, patriotic people on all sides of politics. There may be individuals who are upset with what I said, but none of them emailed me. I mean, I haven't been able to read all my tweets. There's been a million tweets. But I read all my email, all my LinkedIn correspondence. I haven't had any negative replies at all. Nothing. Zero. And Marxist sociologists, old lady Marxist sociologists from Lloyton's Delhi and the traditional elite are wanting selfies. Social exclusion is social exclusion. And the phenomenon works the same, whether it's Muslims in India or African Americans. Rajiv Malhotra has made a big point of this, that there are efforts to present Dalit exclusion in India in racial terms, and to consider it a Black Lives Matter movement in India that has Dalits at its core, and considering this to be a racist, parallel to a critical race theory application to India. Well, people are doing that because, you can take, it's culturally completely different. There's nothing in common with race in America and castes in India. But, you can use the same tools, and you can effectively use the same tools for good or for bad. Look, Muslims face social exclusion in India, in Australia, in the US, and in the UK. Now, I don't mean they face necessarily discrimination. They face social exclusion, meaning that they live apart in many ways. They form their own communities outside the mainstream of society. in a way that, say, Indians in the U.S. or Australia don't. Well, maybe Indians in Australia, but certainly not Indians in the U.S. Indians in the U.S. are fully integrated into U.S. society. Indian Hindus, I should say. Um, uh, so any socially excluded group ends up prone to vote bank politics. I mean, so I'll give you an example of how it works in Australia. In Australia, Muslims are overwhelmingly voting for the Labour Party in Australia. The Labour Party is promoting. Oh, it has a whole narrative around trans rights, around having drag queens in schools, about women's and gender rights, women's quotas, all these sort of very progressive gender and sexuality issues that are anathema in the Australian Muslim community. But the
Hello?
Muslim community gets its veto. Yes, you hear me? The Muslim community gets its veto over the one or two issues it cares about. So it gets a veto over Israel. Australia, just last month, recognized Tel Aviv as the capital of Israel and unrecognized Jerusalem. Now, that's not done. I mean, when the state makes a decision, that's an act of state, not an act of government. And the recognition of Jerusalem by the last government in Australia should have stuck. But the Labour Party's beholden for a certain number of issues to the Muslim preference, and so that change was made purely to mollify the Muslim vote bank of the Labour Party. Now, that sort of thing with socially excluded groups happens. I have an article out just now on Quadrant. It's a humor article. I write a humor column called The Philistine, and the current edition of The Philistine is on Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is vice president because the African-American community, the leaders of the African-American community insisted, Joe Biden will support you. What we get is Kamala Harris. Now, they may regret it now, but that's what they wanted and that's what they got. They get one special issue and then they're ignored on everything else. Okay.
Because if you actually take the context and theory behind critical theory, it would suggest that the world should be trying to uplift Hindus in any way we can. And how would you describe that contradiction? It doesn't make any sense.
That's an extraordinarily complex question. I don't think I can answer it in 1 minute. Look, everything has much more to do with practical politics than with actual theory. I mean, the theory justifies what people feel. All of critical theory that's been exported from Germany, the Germans meant it. Americans don't mean it. It's just a vocabulary they can use. It's like Bernie Sanders calling himself a socialist. He's not a socialist. He's not going to nationalize America's state industries if he were to be president. We take the vocabulary of critical theory. We don't actually take the theory of critical theory because it's so foreign to Anglo-American traditions. So we're taking this vocabulary and we're applying it to our own political sociology. In our political sociology, African Americans are socially excluded, and so we apply critical theory to them. But it wasn't meant for them. It was developed in a much different context. And this is a problem. I mean, even the words left and right were developed for the French Revolution, and the left are the Jacobins, and the right are the monarchists, and that's meaningless in the Anglo-American context. We've used the terms, but American quote-unquote leftists are nothing like the real leftists in Europe or Latin America. American quote-unquote right-wingers are nothing like the real right-wingers in Latin America and Europe. Don't take the theory too seriously. I know the people who propound the theory believe they take it seriously. But I think if you go back and read the original works and start thinking, is this actually being applied? This is not about actual oppression. Oppression is just the language of it. It's simply applying that language to things you already feel. Pareto, I'm a big fan of Vilfredo Pareto, the classic Italian economist and sociologist. And Pareto insisted, and I wrote a humor column about Pareto too, if anyone wants it. Google it or ask me for it. He said, look, people have these feelings, and then they'll have derivations to try to explain why their feelings are correct. But the feelings are the fundamental thing, not the intellectual justification for the feelings. I just don't take critical theory very seriously. I don't think it's you can't get into a battle of No, we're actually more oppressed than someone else. Who wants to be in that battle? Correct the record, right? The battle of who's more oppressed is just not one you even want to win, right? So let it go. Let people, let shrill people yell and yell on the margins and move on with your lives. That would be my advice.